Burghley. You're all fairly familiar with it, I'm sure. William Cecil built the house. It's one of the great prodigy houses of the first Elizabethan age. He built three great houses. He, as you know, was principal secretary to Queen Elizabeth. She relied upon him. He was her advisor. Unlike her young courtiers, he didn't flirt with her and keep her amused. She regarded him more as, I think, almost a father figure or an avuncular figure for good advice. And she listened to him. She respected him and he respected her. He effectively ran this country. He's exactly what we need now, a great statesman. As I say, three houses were built by him. Exeter House on the Strand, Theobald's Palace in Hertfordshire, neither of which still exist, and Burghley. He built Burghley as a home for the dynasty that he knew he was founding. The family, or rather his two sons, were created earls by King James in 1605, and the family, the rank was later raised to that of Marquess in 1801. After his death in 1698, the house continued. We know little about that time, but from the 17th century, we do know a good deal about the house and what went on there. These two gentlemen are the two grand tourists that I'm going to talk about this evening. They were the earls that made the most difference to Burghley as we know it. John, the fifth Earl, and Brownlow, the ninth, lived and worked about 100 years apart, but they both had the same love of Italy and France and all that was there. John was born in 1648. He was a child of the interregnum and all of the political chaos that involved. He married in 1670 Anne, who was a daughter of the Earl of Devonshire. She'd previously been married at the age of 14 to a gentleman named Lord Rich, who was just that. He died quite soon. One wonders why. But he left her a substantial inheritance, and being a Cavendish, she was not poor anyway. And so she brought to the Exeter family a considerable fortune. She was also a very like mind to her husband, and together they were very progressive. They both loved the modern then. He disliked his Tudor house, his ancestors' Tudor palace with its dark rooms with leaded light windows and long galleries filled with tapestries and the odd portrait here and there, which was what it was. So he decided to completely and utterly change it. The first place to go was the continent. He undertook during his time at Burghley 4 grand tours. The grand tour, when he went for the first time, was in its youth. I think the first grand tourist was somebody, Lord Arundel, probably in the 1620s. But it was still a fairly new rite of passage for a young aristocrat. And John, having got his royal pass that enabled an aristocrat to travel, was accompanied by Anne, his wife, which was very rare. Ladies didn't travel in those days very much. She did. Not on every tour. She was pregnant for 2 of them and didn't go, but she traveled on 2, which was quite something. The first tour, as you can see, was somewhat clumsy. The entourage was quite ridiculous, the amount of people that went with them. If you can imagine 30 horses, the carriages and everything else. In fact, it's recorded, the important man there is Culpeper Tanner, the steward. Tanner was a local man. His family came from Easton on the Hill. And he was the Earl's right-hand man. His steward ran the household, kept records of expenditure, and accompanied the Earl on every tour. And it's from his notes, not a diary, sadly, we haven't that, but his notes of expenses and occasions that they had to deal with on these tours has given us the basis of what we know today. And we're so fortunate that my predecessor, Eric Till, studied John V Earl for 40 years and revealed so much about what had gone on and found out so much about the details of the 18th century and 17th century tours. When they got to Italy on the first tour, when they travelled through France and got to Italy, we know from Tanner's notes they had sort of a roadside boot sale to get rid of most of the extraneous baggage. Tanner records it and says in his notes that it went well, but we were bothered by one creeping fellow, Simon, who picked at the prices, or he obviously was a very picky buyer. Anyway, they flogged off most of the kit they took with them. The second tour was much reduced, but I love the fact Tanner records a dog called Towser. Towser went too. You can imagine a mastiff or something like that, something protective. Anyway, the first place they went, the first stopping point on the first tour was Paris, of course. They were entertained at the royal court of the Sun King, King Louis, and saw all of the glories of the French court, which was probably the most spectacular in Europe at the time. They went to the places in Paris that supplied the best objects of art. The Gobelin workshops were the principal centre, and the main occupant of the Gobelin was John Jans with his tapestry workshops. They bought 6 tapestries from them and ordered 4 more. Sadly, the last 4 never arrived at Burghley. They died. We'll get to that. But John Jans then was left with 4 tapestries, which he pestered the estate for payment for 40 years, but never got it, I'm afraid. So they bought tapestries in Paris, and the Countess was very much responsible for the buying of such things as tapestries and textiles as they went. Another workman who had premises in the Gobelin was Pierre Gaulle. Gaulle was eboniste furniture maker to the king. And this was a glorious thing. It's a cabinet that Gaulle made for royal order for the Chateau de Vincennes. For some reason, the king rejected it. He didn't like it. He was very odd like that. So you can imagine the scene, can't you? Mr. Gaulle has been left with this ridiculously expensive bit of cabinetry. And along comes an English milord with his pockets full of cash. So he flogs it to him, along with a table and 2 Garidon candle stands that go with it, which is still in the collection. So it's the most wonderful example of French floral marquetry, and one of the glories of the house. Really, it's a lovely, lovely thing, and would be the kind of thing that, as an aristocratic lady, you kept your jewels and your precious possessions in and showed them off to your friends. And your principal object would sit in the reflected, mirrored central cabinet. Lovely, lovely thing. They went to Italy the first time, and we know whilst they were buying some things, they weren't buying in the quantity that they did in the later trips. The Earl was using the first trip to set up lines of communication. He met bankers, he established lines of credit, he met shippers to organize the eventual transport. He bought a relatively small amount of paintings. The 5th Earl was unusual of his time because he was not buying or not looking for the old masters. The general grand tourist was trying to buy the Titians and the Da Vincis and the Raphaels, and sometimes they were, and sometimes they weren't. But he wanted to buy contemporary art. He wanted to meet the artists that he was buying from and see them work and commission art. So he was most unusual in that respect for the day. And Carlo Dolci was one of the first artists that he met and patronized. And over the next 10, 15 years, he bought 8 of his paintings. And this is a delightful, tiny adoration, but one of the first paintings that was bought. So having set up all of the procedures on subsequent trips, he bought and commissioned wonderful things. This, as you'll see from the dimensions, is huge. It's a flower piece by Recco, who was one of the finest painters of flowers and floral pieces working in Naples. He met Recco. This pair of paintings, in fact, there are 2 of them, were commissioned from the artist with the aid of the local ambassador, who organized payment. Can you imagine, though, I think, consider the logistics of buying things like this and the cabinet that we just saw. You buy it and it's then got to be packaged. Then it goes to somewhere like Livorno, where it goes onto a ship and it crosses the ocean, probably to somewhere like Felixstowe, one of the East Coast ports. And from there it goes by canal, possibly to Peterborough, or in fact up to Stamford, because Stamford was quite well served by canals. And then it's trundled by cart up to the Great House, where it's the Earl's away, of course, he's jaunting in Italy, and his staff unwrap it. Can you imagine unwrapping that? My God, what's he bought now? And where on earth are we going to put it? And this sort of thing occurred for years. It was quite remarkable. The excitement that must have gone on at the house. And the house, of course, is full of decorators and builders. Whilst he's away, Burghley is being gutted and completely refurbished inside. The outside, he left largely alone. A few minor alterations, but the inside, complete revelation. And all of the great craftsmen who were working in England were either working for the king, or for his brother-in-law, or for Jon Cecil. But this is a joy. He also patronized Luca Giordano, and this again is an immense painting, very much of his style. And art historians 40 or 50 years ago, as recently as that, almost wrote off the 5th Earl and dismissed him as saying, oh, he just bought quantity rather than quality. He was a profligate spender and he just bought whatever he came across. Absolute rubbish. We know now that he knew precisely what he was doing. We've got documents in the records which we found over the last 40 years that show that there was correspondence between Tanner, the steward, and a man with the wonderful name of Thomas Stretch, who was an upholsterer, fittingly, who was the deputy steward who took on running Burghley whilst Tanner was in Italy with his master. And they correspond with dimensions of rooms, showing that Stretch writes, show my lady that the dimensions of her dining room are X, Y, and Z, to the corner of the door where the meat comes in, and gives precise dimensions so that they can buy textiles to fit. And he does the same with writing to Tanner with dimensions of rooms and areas in rooms. And there's one marvelous one which really alerted us to this concern. Stretch writes to Tanner and says, the overdoor space is X feet by Y feet. The light comes from ye left for an overdoor. And now the painting that hangs there that was bought by the 5th Earl from David de Koning is a work with dogs and fowl and that sort of thing. And the light comes from the left and illuminates it very well. So he was thinking about what he was doing. The difficult thing must have been is that the rooms at Burghley were being built, if you like. They were there structurally, but the glorious George rooms along the south side, the royal suite, if you like, of 5 rooms, was constructed whilst he was in Italy. And he was buying with areas in sort of places in mind. This is the 3rd George room. And you can see there is the Recco and there's the Giordano. And those are the spaces for which he planned them to be in. But of course, the walls weren't there. It's an astonishing talent or credit to the man and his wife that they planned so well. And the paintings fit the spaces which were effectively finished 100 years later. The George rooms were unfinished for nearly a century. Astonishing. One of the records of Burghley in the 5th Earl's time comes from a remarkable lady, Celia Fiennes. Celia Fiennes was an astonishing woman. She was the daughter of a viscount, and I suspect rather a tomboy, but she decided in late youth to travel around Britain on a horse, on her own. Well, in fact, with one manservant, which was jolly brave. And she used her aristocratic credentials, if you like, to gain entry to places where many wouldn't. And so great houses were a great thing that she visited. She went up to Scotland and covered the whole of the country and wrote diaries, which are really well worth reading, actually. They're remarkable. It's from her that we have the nursery rhyme, Ride a Cock Horse. Celia Fiennes, to see a fine lady upon a white horse, you see, so that comes from Celia Fiennes. And she came to Burghley. The Earl was away, he was travelling, and she wrote about it in her diary. And I think her comments are quite delightful. All right, but very rude. And you can see from the painting by Libery that it was exactly the 5th Earl's taste. There was a great deal of female flesh at Burghley, and still is. And still is. The house, as I say, was being utterly gutted and turned into what they wanted, a European palace. And one of the principal craftsmen, I mean, there were craftsmen all over the house. There were wood carvers, followers of the great Grinling Gibbons, 2 works or 3 by Gibbons himself, but mainly his followers worked for 18 years, carving over doors, painting frame. All these paintings had to have frames. I don't know how many hundreds of feet of frame there are. I must find out one day. But all of these great things coming in had to be framed. And Jonathan Mayne and Edward Young were the principal carvers, and they would have made the frames on site. The other, I mean, there were craftsmen everywhere, but one of the greatest of them was Antonio Verrio. Verrio was a fiery Italian. He had come to England. Ralph Montague from Boughton had brought him to England to work for the king at Windsor, and he decorated a huge suite of rooms at Windsor. All but one of his decorated rooms there were swept away by the restoration and upbringing, altering of Windsor Castle. So there's only one ceiling left. But when the Glorious Revolution came in 1688, he refused to work for William of Orange and went out freelancing and worked for both the 5th Earl of Exeter and his brother-in-law, Lord Devonshire, at Chatsworth and Burghley. And he spent 10 years painting ceilings at Burghley. We have the most marvelous records of his time there. He was an enthusiastic drinker and an enthusiastic epicure. The landlord of the George imported olives, anchovies, olive oil, Bologna sausage. I have the most remarkable page, 2 pages of a bill from the George Hotel to Signor Verrio, as they called him, which records that I think in 2 months he spent a huge amount of money, bottles of what the innkeeper writes down as rad port. And Dr. Till pointed out to me, you must almost, if you're trying to decipher a document written at that time, try and read it with a slightly Norfolk accent. Rad port. And Verrio and his companions consumed lots and lots of rad port and sherry and so on and so forth. And there's a lovely entry in this remarkable bill. The last entry is 25 bottles, which means that the party got rowdy and they broke the bottles. Good fun was had, good fun was had. So these wonderful rooms were created, but were unfinished. So you have rooms with wonderfully decorated ceilings, and the heaven rooms, the walls as well, but no paneling, no proper flooring, and empty. The last trip to Italy was in 1699. And when it was timed nicely because they arrived in Rome in time for the Jubilee celebration. It's interesting because for years, the possible Catholicism of the Earl and his Countess has always been a matter of debate. He had very Catholic tastes, certainly, but of course, following the Catholic faith was unpopular at that time. It wasn't illegal, but you had to be careful. I don't think there's any doubt that when we know the Countess was Catholic in her tastes and religion, and I think the Earl as well, because on that last journey to Rome for the Jubilee celebrations, they visited 5 of the Stations of the Cross, were presented to the Pope, who awarded them a medal and so on, which doesn't happen to a Protestant. So I think his Catholicism was pretty much confirmed. Whilst they were in Rome on that last trip, they met and sat to the sculptor Monod, Pierre-Etienne Monod, who was one of the greatest sculptors working in Rome at the time. And he carved both of their busts as Roman emperor and empress. And he also was commissioned to create the most remarkable funerary monument for the couple. Unfortunately, it was required rather earlier than they might have thought, because on the way home from that trip at Issy, just outside Paris, they stayed for 2 months and the Earl died there. We don't know what from, but he died suddenly. And their incredible funerary monument, which is in St. Martin's Church and well worth seeing if you haven't seen it, was shipped rapidly, or actually it took 5 years, but it gradually came across Europe. We have one lovely document from a wharf keeper, basically writing to the 6th Earl, who had inherited the 5th Earl's debts, saying that if you don't pay the bills for the wharfage and the shipping, it's going into the dock. It did eventually arrive here. It was set up in 1704 and serves as monument, the Countess as well, who died in that year. But do go and see it in St. Martin's if you can. As I say, there were debts, as you will well imagine. They both died thousands of pounds in debt. The estate was encumbered for years. It wasn't until the 8th Earl did that sensible thing and married a woman with money. Always a good move, always a good move. He married the daughter of a copper founder and magnate from Derby, who was immensely wealthy and gave his daughter a huge dowry. In fact, the wonderful silver wine cooler, which those of you who know the house will be familiar with, was his wedding present to them. In other words, making the statement, you may well have the earldom, but I've got the money. There we are. It's quite a gift, isn't it? So it wasn't until this gentleman took over. Brownlow, the 9th Earl, inherited from his father, the 8th Earl, an estate that was economically sound for the first time in several generations. And he married, just before he inherited, he married another wealthy lady. This is Letitia. Letitia Townshend. Walpole records that Letitia Townshend brought 70,000 with her as dowry. 70,000 at that time, the king's ransom. So he was extremely well equipped. And unfortunately, Letitia died very young, within 6 years of the marriage. And so Brownlow was left desolate, a widower. He didn't want to marry again, obviously. He could have done, given his financial position and place. He didn't want to. He decided to do what his great-grandfather had done and visit Italy. Now, by that time, of course, we're talking 18th century, the Grand Tour had become a rite of passage for a young aristocrat. You sent your eldest son off to Europe. They learned about the classics, they learned fine art, they met all the right people, and they were able to buy things for their wonderful houses that they were either building or had been built by their ancestors at home. So it was very much a journey that as a young aristocrat you had to make, and most of them did. Brownlow went to Italy. He made 2 grand tours. He went to Italy for the first time in 1763 and went back in 1767-8. He set off for Italy in 63. His trips there are fairly well recorded. Annoyingly, again, he didn't keep a diary. But we know from contemporary papers that he was very quickly accepted into the smart set in Rome, as you would be as a young, wealthy aristocrat. And he met all the right people, Gavin Hamilton and the various lords that were traveling, and this lady, Angelica Kaufmann. Angelica was Austrian. She was one of the most popular artists in Rome at that period. She was everything really that a young widowed aristocrat would like. She could sing, she played music, she wrote, and she painted beautifully. And I'm quite sure, I've always maintained that he was in love with her. I think he bought 14 of her paintings, which indicates some amour. And also we have 2 huge folio folders of prints from her paintings. He encouraged her to come to London, where he and Lord Palmerston, in fact, sponsored her, and she became one of the first women members of the Royal Academy. She was immensely popular at the time, and is still. This is her portrait, very famous portrait of Garrick. She painted in London. And Garrick also was one of the set that was in Rome. She knew him from there. He bought good things. He was taken up very quickly by the antiquaries. Antiquaries specialized in cultivating young aristocrats and then advising them on what best to buy and introducing them to the people that could supply them with the best things to buy. This is a micromosaic. It's made from casting or blowing incredibly thin rods of colored glass and then fragmenting them and taking the fragments and inserting them into a plaster background to make a picture. It's about this big, and it's a very lovely thing. And we have the letters from James Byers, one of the antiquaries, recommending Aguati to my Lord Exeter and saying that his work is the greatest micromosaic that you will ever see, and so on. They're good things. They're lovely, lovely things. He bought all sorts of curiosities, good things that a good aristocratic tourist would buy. This is a lovely little thing. It's a gold decorated snuff box. And the 9th Earl was a great one for making notes. He made notes everywhere. He was almost obsessive about recording details. And there is a note by him in his, once you've seen his hand, you know it forever. He made his own ink, and his handwriting is very fine. He records this as being a box made of lava from the island of Ischia. But inside it are these three very rough pebbles. And I say interesting provenance because they're great fun. He puts a note inside saying, the stones are 3 pieces of Pompey's pillar, received from the captain of the ship who had them from the 3 marines that climbed the column and drank a bowl of punch thereon. Now, there's a story behind that, because this climbing Pompey's column was no small feat. Pompey's column was in Alexandria on the North African coast, and it was an immense marble column. It was 27 meters tall, and originally it supported a 7-meter tall porphyry statue of the Emperor Diocletian. It was a triumphal monument to Diocletian. By the time the Earl was in Italy in the 18th century, the statue had been destroyed and been removed, but the column still stood. And dear Wikipedia has provided me with, what would we do without it? It records that in 1803, Commander John Shortland of HMS Pandore flew a kite over the pillar. This enabled ropes to be pulled over it, and then a rope ladder. He and John White, Pandore's master, climbed the column. They displayed the Union Jack, drank a toast to King George, and gave 3 cheers. 4 days later, they climbed again, erected a staff, fixed a weather vane, flew a flag, ate a beefsteak, and again toasted the king. Quite something, quite something. And it became a sort of naval tradition that if you docked in Alexandria, you or your Marines or anybody had a go at climbing Pompey's column, which must have been quite something. It's thought possibly that it became so popular for sailors in His Majesty's Navy that the nickname Pompey, Pompey's Boys, was transferred to Portsmouth, the Navy's home, which is referred to as Pompey. It's a bit sort of dodgy as that's true or not, but it's a nice thought. This is another very good example of a very apposite souvenir. It's a table on a mahogany base made by Mayhew and Ince, who were the Earl's principal furniture maker, London furniture maker. And when I first came across it, the family knew it as a specimen marble top table, and there are 3 of them in the collection, 2 on different bases. And it wasn't until, I think it was in the early 90s, when a lady came up from the British Museum researching something, and she brought her husband with her. And her husband was a volcanologist. And he passed by this and said, "Oh, you've got a lava table." And we said, "Really? Didn't know that?" He said, "Oh, yes, these circles, they're not marble samples, they're polished lava." And so it's a perfect Grand Tour souvenir, do you see? I've been to Italy, I've seen Vesuvius, I've seen Etna, and brought back the T-shirt. You know, I mean, here it is, here's my proof. And he gave one of these to the British Museum, where it still lives, sadly in a corridor, but also had 3 made up into furniture, which is still at Burghley. But it is, as I say, the classic souvenir, really. These are other examples of good souvenirs and other examples of things which might be right and might not. The urn is made of porphyry. Porphyry is this marvelous, I don't think it's not marble, it's a red stone which was mined in North Africa by the Romans and reserved for imperial use in Rome and Roman cities for columns and altars and so on and so forth. And the mines were played out by the 18th century. There was no more porphyry to be dug. And so porphyry came from things that were dug up, particularly around Rome. Columns and altars were broken down and the material was used. So this could be a Roman urn, and it was sold to the Earl as a Roman urn, but it also could be made the day before. The lion falls into the same category. It's pink marble. It's a lovely sculpture, and it was sold to Lord Exeter as Roman, having been dug up in the ruins of Hadrian's villa. Well, there were people working in Rome and in Italy generally, but in Rome at that time, probably the cleverest of whom was a man called Caviceppi, who had a workshop which specialized in producing just this sort of thing for the rich my lord. And you can almost imagine the situation. Lord Exeter says to James Byers or Thomas Jenkins or one of his ciceroni, I like that. Oh, how big would you like it? Well, about this was, we'll go and see Mr. Caviceppi on Friday. And lo and behold, there would be one there. It's probably Roman, but it might not be. This points out something which is interesting, interested me. At that time, there were no sources of reference for the connoisseur going abroad and wanting to buy fine art, apart from what he was told when he got there. Because there was no British Museum, there was no V&A, there were no books on the subject, there was no points of reference. And so you went and you met people like Thomas Jenkins and James Byers, and you relied upon them to guide you to what was good or what wasn't. And if somebody you were told was an expert said it was good, you bought it because it was bound to be good. And that's why Lord Exeter bought this, which is, well, a dog of a painting. It's a very bad copy of Raphael's, or workshop of Raphael's original, probably painted a few months before the Earl bought it. No, the paint would have been wet. It's not the real thing at all. It's an arrant fake. But he bought it in all confidence, and it was reported in the newspapers at home that my Lord Exeter has bought this marvellous Raphael and it's coming back to England and so on. There was great fuss made about it. And it's one of two really bad paintings that he bought, thinking they were good, but not because he had bad judgment, but because he had bad advice. So you had to be very careful what you were buying and where. He did, however, make some really, really wonderful purchases. He bought these three paintings. They're by Paolo Veronese, who was one of, well, probably the greatest Venetian artist of the 16th century. They came from the chapel of the Church of St. James on the Isle of Murano in the Venetian lagoon, which had fallen into disrepair, as so much of Venice had done at that time. And works of art from these religious buildings were available, had you enough money and the right contacts. You're back to Mr. Byers and Mr. Jenkins, who guided him to these. The Petitioning of Christ is the altarpiece at Burghley. It's 17 feet high. It's massive. And this was one of the things that Veronese was famous for, his bright colours and the size of his paintings. The church, as I say, was in disrepair. Lord Exeter was able to buy part of what was there as a triptych. There were three of these. One is now in the Barber Institute in Birmingham. One's in the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital, and the other is at Burghley. And it's one of my dreams that one day some multi-millionaire will come along and enable us to gather them together and exhibit them, not at Burghley, but probably somewhere in London, as a triptych. It would be really great fun. The standing saints were the door panels of the organ in the church, and they are glorious things. So some of the really good things that Brownlow bought. This is glorious. This is a gem. It's about this big. It's by Orazio Gentileschi, who a Genoese artist who was famous for the fine quality of his work. It glows. It's the most lovely little painting. It's got a good story behind the purchase because Lord Exeter very much wanted it and petitioned James Byers to try and buy it for him. and buyers writes to Lord Exeter in, where are we, in 1773, that unfortunately, I'm afraid, the Jesuits will not part with their painting. It was owned by the Jesuit Foundation. Well, it then passed to Pope Clement when the Jesuit order was dissolved by papal order in 1773, and the Pope presented it to Lord Exeter. It's a very strange thing. It's recorded at the time that Pope Clement presented this painting to Lord Exeter, apparently for the respect that Lord Exeter showed him whilst he was in Rome. And Lord Exeter reciprocated by presenting the Pope with a telescope. Can you imagine? I mean, Vatican Palace with telescope on the top, gazing at the heavens, getting a bit closer. You know, the Pope was apparently an astronomer. But anyway, that is the truth. It's recorded in the Burghley Archive. But it is the most fabulous little painting. Orazio had a daughter called Artemisia, who is very much the buzzword of the moment. Artemisia is a feminist icon because of the sad circumstance of her life, really. Her father taught her to paint, and she became a really first-class artist. Her father let rooms in his house to another artist called Tassi, who raped poor Artemisia. And unusually for the period, father and daughter decided to prosecute. And Artemisia was tortured by the judiciary to prove that she was not lying. And Tassi was eventually found guilty and expelled from Rome. I mean, what a dreadful punishment. It was totally and completely horrendous. And so because of that, Artemisia and her work took on a certain sort of notoriety. And many of her works feature feminist heroines in situations like this, where Susanna is being lectured at by the elders who said, if you don't let us have our way with you, we will tell the seniors of the town that you tried to seduce us and so on. And she appealed, and in fact, the elders were chucked out rather than her. But it was that kind of subject that Artemisia painted so well. There's another incredible painting by her. I forget where it lives, but it's Judith and her handmaiden cutting the head off Holofernes. It's famous. It's gory and glorious. It really is. But she became famous for this sort of thing, and also for paintings that featured quite a lot of female flesh. And she was quite well known for altering paintings to suit the client. So if the client wanted a little bit more female flesh, she would alter it to that end. I mean, artists paint to make money. They don't paint for love. They paint to live. And if Mr. Client wants something, you do it. This was bought by Brownlow from the Barberini Palace. At the time, the Barberini was occupied by a contessa, an elderly contessa who gambled. And she paid her gambling debts by flogging the family paintings. And this was one of them. It's one of the treasures at Burghley. Because of Artemisia's fame at the moment, she's very much the buzzword. I've lent that painting 12 times in the last 15 years to exhibitions abroad. And we've actually, it's going to go once more, I think, to the Getty for one great, but we've now decided that that's enough traveling. It's too dangerous. So it's hanging again at Burghley for the moment. This is probably the greatest painting that Brownlow bought. It's by one of the great masters of the 16th century, Jacopo Pisano. The Pisano family were all artists. This was the grandfather. This was the original and best, if you like. And he painted this for the gentleman wearing the turquoise suit in the center, who was from the Zorza family. It shows the adoration of the three kings. I think it's got the best portrayal of a horse that I think I've ever seen in it. That horse is majestic. It really is. It hangs in the Red Drawing Room at Burghley and is one of the great treasures of the house. And it is recorded, Lord Exeter records it as being brought out of Venice in my gondola by night. Again, there were backhanders obviously paid along the way. My last slide, really, or second to last, is of a recent acquisition. This is a painting, or a pastel, by an artist, a very good artist called Jon Russell, who was a very fine pastelist, if that's the right word. This is the 9th Earl's sister, Lady Elizabeth, Lady Betty. Lady Betty was his great confidant, familiar. He was widowed, as I say. He loved his sister, he respected her, and she married and moved to Yorkshire and married a man called Chaplin. The Chaplin family became Viscounts, but she married when they were just not Viscounts and moved to Blankney in Yorkshire. Her husband died, and the 9th Earl relocated her to Uppingham, to Glaston House in Uppingham nearby, and set up a house for her, which he decorated and furnished and so on, because he wanted her to look after Burghley whilst he was away. The little notes on the right are one page from a tiny notebook. It's about this by this. And it's the kind of thing that if you're a compulsive obsessive, you might keep in your bedside table. And when you think of a good thing in the middle of the night, you'd write it down. And this was written down by the 9th Earl before he went to Italy. And he records all sorts of, well, miscellaneous thoughts. He was a bit of a compulsive. Interestingly, sorry, I'm complete tangent, but the wife of a great friend of Burghley, who's dead now, was one of the great experts, Oliver Impey. His wife was a neurologist, and we were talking with Lady Victoria and myself about the 9th Earl one night and how he was a compulsive note maker. And she looked at his portrait and said, and looked at his notes and said, is he ever recorded as being epileptic? And we said, yes, he had an epileptic fit in '67 before he went to Italy. So I thought so. These tiny, tiny, tiny notes, things like the end of my dining room to be wainscoted next spring, and the whole room new painted of a pearl colour, and the gilding refreshed. The Duke of Montrose, Lord Marham, and Mr. Garrick, never to be denied when they send for game or venison. The same for Mr. Trollope and Mr. Barty. Of course, the Trollops and the Bartys were neighbours. Fires to be lit weekly in all of the rooms on the north side of the house to prevent damp. Lady Betty Chaplin is desired to make frequent visits to Burghley without giving notice of her coming. She will ensure that everything is kept neat, both in house and garden. Can you imagine the servants? Oh my God, it's Lady Betty's carriage coming up the drive. Oh, she must have been quite some lady. It's a very good pastel. It really is. Astonishingly, I say it's a recent acquisition because it came up 2 years ago at a local auction house who didn't actually tell us that they had it in their stock. And it was pure luck that Orlando and Miranda went to look at the sale with a view, they were looking at something else completely. And Orlando spotted it a room away and said, my God. And it wasn't difficult to tell because it's got a gilt thing on the frame saying Lady Elizabeth Cecil, daughter of the 8th Earl of Exeter. So it wasn't exactly difficult to decipher who it was. And on the back, it's got the provenance. It came when the Chaplin estate was sold. It had stayed with the Chaplins. And when the Chaplin estate was sold at Sotheby's, it was bought then by a chap called Bob Woolsey. I think was his name, Bob Woolsey, who lived in the old rectory at Clipsham. And he bought it because his wife was a chaplain. So when we managed to buy this glorious thing, and it is glorious, it's a real fabulous portrait, I very excitedly rang John Somerville, who is our honorary keeper of paintings and a great expert, and said, John, you won't guess what we've managed to buy. and sent him a photograph and so on and so forth. And he rang me back. He said, I know this picture. I said, well, how? He said, well, where did it come from? So I told him the provenance. He said, I used to stay with Bob Wolsey. I've slept in the bedroom where that used to hang. I mean, what a coincidence. I can't tell you these things. This is what the house does time and time again. It just thinks, oh, we'll throw up something of interest. But a really, really lovely thing, and an absolute gem to be able to buy into the collection. It is about 30 by 40, something like that, portrait size. And very, very beautifully done. Russell was one of the great pastelists of his time. Interestingly, we unframed it when it came to Burghley because the frame was dusty on the inside and so on. And Louise Drover, who's a conservator who does a lot of work for me, she's the most marvelous work on paper conservator. And we took it out of the frame and she checked it all out and cleaned 1 or 2 tiny marks from it. But said, it's on that fabulous French blue paper. And I said, what do you mean? She said, look, the background is blue. And pastelists of that period apparently bought paper made in France from the redundant military uniforms of the French army, which was blue serge, because it's a fluffy paper that takes pastel very well. Sorry, another tangent, but anyway, I thought it was interesting. But anyway, a glorious thing and lovely to have in the collection now. She hangs in the same room as that fabulous portrait of her brother by Angelica. So there we are. Now, I think it remains only to say 2 things. The first is last year we published the Book of Burghley. The essays in it are written by John Martin Robinson, who is a genius and has done some wonderful writing about the house. And the photographs are taken by Ashley Hicks, David Hicks' son, who has done a really splendid job of recording Burghley. I promote it as being available in the Burghley gift shop in the courtyard, which is open from Friday the 5th of February every day. And I will leave it on the side here if you'd like to have a look. Please do, please do. And I think the other thing to say is to thank Graham and all of his ladies for inviting me and letting me do this. The gallery is, I think, fabulous. And well, most of you must know it, but anybody who hasn't seen all of it, go and explore. It's quite remarkable. And thank you very much.